This week on Just Solutions, the World Health Organization has recently issued a report that warns the burning of fossil fuels is killing us. But still, governments worldwide are failing to take action to curb emissions. A year ago on the campaign trail, Joe Biden promised to ban oil and gas permitting on federally owned land. But President Biden has yet to fulfill that promise. So what is the future of fossil fuels? Our guest today is Jean Su, Energy Justice Programme Director and Senior Attorney with the Centre for Biological Diversity, who says President Biden must use his executive powers to speed the end of the fossil fuel era and ignite a just renewable energy revolution. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. It's great to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us. And the Centre for Biological Diversity has just released 5 actions that you are calling President Biden to take. These are 5 executive actions that would essentially bypass the gridlock that we're seeing right now around congressional action on the climate crisis. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. But as we start off, outline those 5 actions that you're calling for President Biden to take.
Great, absolutely. So, we've been calling for these actions from day one of the presidency. We actually don't see it as anything in conflict with congressional action. Absolutely, we need Congress, we need the executive, we need all branches of government and all levels of government going for as big a climate solution as possible. So in terms of executive actions, there are 5 top key executive powers that the Biden administration has had since day one. The first is basically canceling all approvals of fossil fuel infrastructure. It is not a hyperbole to say that President Biden, with the stroke of his pen, right now could actually stop Line 3 and all infrastructure projects across the country. The second is a huge presidential campaign promise that helped elect President Biden, which was to stop all fossil fuel leasing and drilling on federal lands. Federal lands belong to everybody in this country, yet it's being marketed off at really low rates, kind of piddly pennies, to extract dangerous fossil fuels, oil and gas in this country. Again, President Biden can actually single-handedly cancel that fossil fuel leasing program today and stop a huge amount of fossil fuels from being extracted in this country. A third executive action that's absolutely vital that the president can take is to declare a climate emergency. And with that climate emergency, he would be able to reinstate the crude oil export ban that the Obama administration actually overturned in 2015. So the crude oil export ban was in place for decades due to the Arab oil embargo in the 1970s. And as the fracking boom was starting in the US, fracking not only of gas, but also oil, there was huge lobbying pushes to basically overturn the ban on exports. When that crude oil export ban was reinstated or was overturned essentially in 2015, that helped drive a huge amount of fracking across the country for crude oil. If President Biden were to declare a climate emergency, he would be able to put that ban in place and stop that export and therefore stop the need to keep fracking our lands for oil and gas. A fourth and fifth piece, which is really vital to all of this, is not only the fossil fuel equation, but the renewable energy equation. We know what we have to stop, but what do we need in order to fill that gap for energy? And this is where President Biden, again, has tremendous and immense executive powers to really ignite our renewable energy revolution. So the first action in that is the use of the Defense Production Act. So the Defense Production Act, again, was passed as a wartime era statute. It was passed for the Korean War. And in that, the United States government was able to manufacture and marshal private industry to make tanks and other necessities on the ground to fight different wars. And at that point, it was the Korean War. What we are asking President Biden to do now is essentially view the climate emergency as a war. Essentially, the Pentagon just hours ago actually issued a report that said the climate emergency is at the top of the national security threat for the country. So through that lens of actual defense, he would be able, under the Defense Production Act, to marshal and coordinate private companies in this country and tell them that we have a renewable energy revolution to ignite in order to defend ourselves against the climate emergency. He would be able to tell private companies to manufacture solar panels, wind turbines, all the interconnection pieces and microgrids, and clean energy vehicles, electric transportation and buses, all of those pieces that are actually necessary to transform our domestic industry, create millions of the good paying union jobs that he promised in his first week as president, as well as implement those so that everybody across the country is able to benefit and have clean energy in their homes. So the Defense Production Act would allow for him to do that, to manufacture the domestic industry pieces, and to also essentially create a climate resilient system for the United States to have.
Well, there's a lot to...
Oh, sorry,
please go ahead. I was going to say there's a lot to dig in, but please do finish up, and then we're going to extrapolate a little bit more on some of these points.
Great. And the fifth one, and the laundry list here, but kind of key 5 ones. The fifth one is using the Stafford Act and FEMA, essentially the Federal Emergency Management Agency, to actually rebuild resilient climate systems when a disaster hits, and to prioritize in areas essentially that have been the hardest hit, not only from natural disasters and climate-induced disasters of hurricanes and flooding, but also the fossil fuel industry. And these are essentially the communities that have been hit first and worst from the climate emergency, not only from fossil fuel plants in their backyard, but the horrific climate-induced hurricanes and storms that have been coming. And so those are our Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other communities of color in this country.
And those were exactly the communities that were mobilizing in Washington, D.C. just a week ago for the People versus Fossil Fuels actions to highlight the disproportionate impact of fossil fuel extraction and infrastructure on these communities, whether it's Indigenous peoples, Indigenous nations, or, as you said, working class, Black and Brown communities, often immigrant communities that are living beside these processing plants that are having this infrastructure built right in their neighborhoods. But as I said, there's a lot to dig in there. But I do want to touch on one of the points you made there about reinstating the ban on export of crude oil, because when fracking is presented in communities around the country, it is often presented as this will benefit your community. This will lower the price of heating your homes. This is something that is crucial for domestic energy. Very, very little discussion about how much of this is actually being exported to other countries who are then also bearing the brunt of fossil fuel extraction. How much are we talking about when we're talking about the export of fossil fuels and the export of crude oil? What difference would it make if that ban was reinstated?
Yeah, so crude oil production exports have increased by 70% due to the export of the reinstatement of the ban. And what's interesting about the crude oil exports in general is that they actually go to 2 different endpoints. One is that we have crude oil in this country, and oil refineries have not actually been developed to process crude oil. So some of that crude oil that's being exported is being refined elsewhere in the world and comes back into the country to be burned. So it's not that this crude oil is necessarily never going to come back to the US. It does come back, and it pollutes countries here or communities here. In addition, as you said, that crude oil is going to China and different parts of Europe, where it is also being burned and being a huge polluting factor for countries out there. So the crude oil export ban was really a key to the fracking boom that we've seen in this country. And there have been so many sacrifice zones that have resulted from that. And that's why so many people, literally thousands, were in the streets in DC last week protesting it. You know, one of the most important pieces last week is this idea of declaring a climate emergency. I think that's the most visceral and understandable way for people to convey why it's so necessary to actually have these executive actions in place right now. People are actually living this climate emergency, whether it was Hurricane Ida or all the horrific tropical storms that hit the Northeast and the Southeast this year, or whether you were in the heat dome in the Pacific Northwest, or surrounded as you are, Maeve, in Colorado and the West with wildfires that you've never seen before. People are experiencing the climate emergency. They are demanding a declaration of that emergency and all the executive powers available to the Biden administration to act boldly on this. We do not have any time to punt this anymore to Congress. Congress has its own level of doing things, its own level of dysfunction, its own capture of by oil and gas interests. And we're here right now. We elected, so many of those communities last week elected President Biden to fix the climate emergency. It's incumbent on him to take the powers that he has and do it.
And these are not superlatives that you're using. I mean, we've gone from talking about climate change to a climate crisis. Now we're in a real climate emergency. This is language that we're seeing the World Health Organization
Absolutely.
using, saying that the continued extraction of fossil fuels and burning of fossil fuels is directly impacting our health and actually to a deadly effect. And even just earlier this year, the International Energy Agency released a report finding that there can be no investment in new fossil fuel supply projects. And this is the International Energy Agency. These international organizations are ringing the alarm. The IPCC said this is code red right now. And yet we're not seeing the action. In fact, right after that IPCC Code Red report came out recently, Joe Biden urged OPEC to increase production because of gas prices. And so we're seeing such disconnect. You know, candidate Biden made a lot of promises, but President Biden seems yet to be acting on any of those.
Yes, absolutely. You know, we're all headed to Glasgow next week. And Secretary Antonio Guterres, who said that the IPCC report was the death knell for the world, also urged governments to stop punting on this question of fossil fuels. He himself said that the answer is actually right in front of us. We are right now at 1.2 degrees of warming. We are on our way to 1.5. Anything beyond that literally is a death knell for the planet. And it is, you know, the UN Secretary General, scientists, climate scientists, everybody around the world, and the grassroots global up population are calling on politicians to act. This is literally a tug of war between literally the fate of the planet and the existential nature of our species and our communities against politicians and the wealthiest industry in the world. This is literally money against people. This is capitalism against popular and public interest. And if you are a politician, you were elected by people to make decisions in their best public interest, not in the interest of fossil fuel industries. So we are asking the Biden administration to really take heed of who got him into that office in the first place. Now they are here in DC demanding what they elected him for.
You mentioned earlier the dysfunction that we're seeing in Congress and the influence of money from the fossil fuel industry on our politicians. And I think nobody can exemplify that more than Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia. In fact, it's estimated that in this current political cycle, he has received more in political donations from the oil and gas industry than any other senator. This is a Democrat, of course, from West Virginia, heavily invested in the coal industry, and not just politically, but personally, his own personal connections with the coal brokerage firm that he founded several years ago. When you have somebody like Senator Joe Manchin, who can essentially completely obstruct the climate change legislation that's being introduced, it does seem that executive action is the way to get around that. And yet we still need Congress to act as well.
Yes, absolutely. You know, I think there's a frenzy right now. There's absolutely a frenzy right now on Capitol Hill to figure out how we can direct money towards the renewable energy revolution. But, this frenzy was not unforeseeable. It's not surprising. We can all vote count. We all knew that Joe Manchin would be a factor in stopping sweeping climate legislation. So, the issue here is that this is not an and/or situation. This is not executive action versus Congress. This is everybody is all hands on deck. The fact that the Biden administration has known it has had these executive powers, but it has refused to use them and has put all of its eggs on Congress instead is foolish. It's foolish because we have a ticking time bomb in front of us of the climate emergency. He needs to use every single tool that he has in his toolbox. And at the same time, Congress needs to push forth and elect the right types of members, ban fossil fuel industry money from influencing our elections. These are all kind of greater, problems that we have here in the United States, but there is a clear avenue for the president alone to act, and that's what we're asking him to do. Leader Schumer actually in the beginning of the Biden presidency himself, I think made a pretty foreboding statement. He said, he actually urges President Biden to think about declaring a climate emergency. Leader Schumer said that. And in addition to that, Senator Merkley from Oregon also published an important Washington Post op-ed urging the Biden administration to do the same thing. And Representative Blumenauer, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Bernie Sanders followed up with that with a bill in Congress forcing and mandating the president to declare a climate emergency. Congress knows that it has its limits. Congress is absolutely important. It is the vital organ to have important programs set in place for climate. But Congress also in the past has formed statutes which has literally given the president the statutory powers to act on an emergency when he's faced with one. And that's what we are asking President Biden to do, to take those rightful legal authorities and act on them towards the climate emergency.
We'd love to hear from our viewers. Let us know where you're watching and what your thoughts are on this, as we have come out of a week of actions around people versus fossil fuels. And as we're heading into an upcoming International Climate Summit, COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland, what are your thoughts on all of this and the future of fossil fuels? Well, we have Health, Jeeps and Guns, who's watching on YouTube, says, what about starting with the military, as the military industrial complex is one of the largest polluters? There's a lot to dig into. And, that reminds me of a comment you made earlier, Jean Sue, about how this is a defense issue, that
Yes.
The Department of Defense has declared the climate crisis as a defense issue. It seems that in the past, and in the very recent past, not very long ago, our defense mentality, certainly when it came to, international policy, was harnessed around protecting fossil fuel infrastructure and extraction. It seems that we need a complete mindset shift to really embrace moving away from fossil fuel extraction, particularly when we consider ourselves on the global stage.
Absolutely. So I love this question because actually the Pentagon and the Department of Defense, surprisingly, has been one of the most vocal advocates for renewable energy. Many people don't know this, but they have issued a series of declarations over the past 2 decades urging that politicians recognize that climate is a huge national security issue. They have boats that are powered by renewable energy technologies. They are at the forefront of innovating innovating all of their instruments, whether it is their Navy, military, with renewable energy power, because they are in situations where they are not able to get oil and gas easily. So, surprisingly, the military has actually been on the forefront of that. It's the politicians who have inherently decided to enter into areas of the world for oil and gas. So I think there's an important differentiation to make there. And one of the most important things that the president actually has in his collection of tools are powers to direct the military to funnel their funds towards building renewable energy. One of them, if he does declare a national emergency, is to actually distribute military funds towards building out renewable energy projects and systems on government complexes. So this includes building community solar, rooftop solar, wind, and microgrids that basically allow for military complexes and surrounding communities to be self-sufficient and off of fossil fuels. As I said before, the president also has the ability to ignite the Defense Production Act. It's called the Defense Production Act because it is igniting and marshaling private industry and federal loan guarantees and finances towards a renewable energy industry economy for the national defense. And I think that defense issue is absolutely vital for people in this country to understand how the climate emergency is not only impacting them and their ability to get electricity and affordable and reliable electricity, but also the global circumstances of how the climate emergency is affecting our security. There is a huge amount of climate migration happening right now because climate change is decimating farmlands. It is causing drought in all parts of the world. We've already seen migration coming through the border, essentially, because of South America's droughts and flooding that has led to huge food insecurity and also personal security in those areas. So the United States is not immune to that. We see the crisis at our border. That crisis is very connected to the climate emergency. And if we want to start dealing respectfully with what is happening at the border, we need to look at the systemic issues of what's fueling that. And our fossil fuel burning is essentially a key part to that crisis that we are facing in immigration too.
It does seem like one of the major barriers obstructing any progress moving away from fossil fuel burning is the fossil fuel industries themselves and the huge influence, continued political influence of the oil and gas industry. We are seeing some things happening, though, away almost from a governmental level. There was a court in the Netherlands that ruled earlier this year to hold Shell Oil accountable for its impact on the climate crisis. So is this going to be multi-pronged? Governments have failed to really take action. We're seeing the courts holding not just private companies accountable, but also in some circumstances, governments themselves accountable. I mean, it seems like we have to just hit all points that are available to us to really tackle this issue, given the dominance of the oil and gas industry.
Absolutely. We have three branches of government in this country. The judiciary is a vital part of that. I am an attorney, so we definitely are very supportive of the legal actions that are being taken across the world that use, existing statutes and existing law to try to minimize and eliminate the influence of fossil fuels on our political system. Another important part of this equation are, people and local governments. We do have the ability, as in this country at the very least, to elect our leaders. And that means we all have to be extremely cognizant of who we are electing and why. The short-term impacts of some jobs that the fossil fuel industry promises and that politicians are advocating for, that's extremely short-sighted and foolish when we have on the horizon millions of new green jobs that are there waiting, but no politician is essentially clicking on the green light for that to happen. I think as a democracy, we need to have far greater education and activism and mobilization of people to the polls. Of course, our system is also facing a huge voting rights violations issues here as well. So it's all part and parcel of our democracy and fighting how capitalism, as it's skewed in the United States, has affected these very basic dimensions of how we're supposed to work. People are experiencing the climate emergency. They want action, but right now districts are being gerrymandered. People are being cut off from getting to the voting polls. So when we talk about the climate emergency, it is not simply fossil fuels and this abstract concept, it is infiltrating every single part of how we live here. And it's absolutely vital that we see that climate crests everything. So we have to push for reform on all of these different levels. Another thing I did want to say is that local governments also have an incredible amount of power that they might not be cinching right now. One of the important revolutions that we're seeing in different cities is gas bans. There is a huge push right now for different cities to ban the use of gas in people's homes, to stop gas from being used as a heating source and an electrification source. And I think those are the types of places where we can also see movement, when people on a very local level are rejecting fossil fuels and essentially boycotting it.
Well, we just have a few minutes left, but I do want to just talk about, a central part of your work, Jean, is you are the Energy Justice Program Director at the Centre for Biological Diversity. And energy justice is something that we have heard so much about because of the disproportionate impact on communities of colour and working class communities of fossil fuel extraction and processing. But how do we have energy justice in a renewable energy future so that those same dynamics around capitalism that excludes certain people from being able to participate fully and to have the full benefits of renewable energy, how do we ensure real energy justice even with renewable energy?
Yes, absolutely. And that is a huge hole missing in the federal landscape right now. What energy justice means for communities, especially communities of color in the United States, is having affordable, resilient, and clean energy that is not poisoning them in their backyards. So what that looks like on a very foundational level is having rooftop solar on your roof. It's having community solar for renters. And it's being hooked up to microgrids and systems that do not go out when hurricanes or floods come and you are cut off suddenly from life-saving medicine and internet and essentially life-saving sources. The current energy system is inherently racist. The fossil fuel complex has put fossil fuel plants, dirty gas plants, oil refineries in the backyards of communities of color in this country. And what we need is a complete closing of those systems, but also to replace them with democratic systems that people can actually choose clean energy for themselves. What microgrids and community solar and rooftop solar give people is the ability to be resilient and to withstand climate emergencies, but to also have affordable energy through rooftop and community solar, which right now the prices are diving at extraordinary levels. The utility complex in and of itself has been a huge obstructing factor to our renewable energy transition. Electric utilities in this country, for instance, have taken billions of dollars from federal packages and have not even put that towards saving people's electricity during COVID and other disasters. They have actively obstructed rooftop and community solar from coming online because it hits at their bottom line themselves. They see rooftop and community solar as essentially competitors. What we need to do is basically switch that model. A public right like energy should not be delivered by private industry. They have another incentive of privatizing and maximizing shareholder profits. Electricity is a human right. It should not be poisoned. It should not be poisonous. And community and rooftop solar, microgrids, and storage are all part of a technology package to allow communities to take back energy, to own it, and to essentially breathe and have the right to have reliable energy at all times.
Well, Jean Sue with the Centre for Biological Diversity, thank you so much for taking time to talk to us.
Thank you so much, Maeve. Appreciate it.
And just to let our viewers know, Just Solutions is now available as a podcast. You can tune in and listen back to interviews anytime. Just subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And tune in next week for more conversation on the climate crisis as we look ahead to COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland. What lies ahead, what decisions will be made, what voices will be heard, and what voices may be excluded. Tune in same time, same place next week from Free Speech TV, Just Solutions.